The wind that October morning in 1931 didn't howl. It screamed, a high, thin wail that slipped between the ribs of the SS Baychimo like a knife searching for a heart, and every man aboard felt it find theirs. Captain Sidney Cornwell Jr. stood on the bridge wing, coat collar turned up, beard already rimed with frost that glittered like broken glass under the weak Arctic sun, and he watched the ice close its fist around his ship the way a father watches a fever climb his child's cheeks, powerless, furious, praying the next breath won't be the last. Below him, 22 souls moved across the deck in slow, deliberate steps, each footfall a question none of them dared ask aloud. Are we already dead and just too stubborn to lie down? They had left Nome on the 2nd of September with a belly full of fox, bear and marten pelts, dreams of fat bonuses dancing in their heads, men who had kissed wives and sweethearts goodbye with promises of Christmas in Seattle, of warm rum and warmer arms. But now, a month later, the Bering Sea had turned traitor, packing the Baychimo in a cradle of ice that grew thicker every hour, a cradle that rocked only one way, down. Engineer James McTavish, Big Jimmy to the crew, a Glasgow lad with hands like hams and a laugh that could shake snow from the rigging, stood at the rail staring at the white plain that stretched to every horizon, and when young cabin boy Tommy Doyle sidled up beside him, cheeks raw from crying, Jimmy wrapped one massive arm around the boy's shoulders and whispered, "Dinny fret, lad, steel remembers the sea even when the sea forgets itself." But his voice cracked on the last word because he could feel the ship groan, a deep metallic sigh that said she was tired, so tired of fighting. The thermometer outside the chart room read -32 Fahrenheit and still falling, and every exhale hung in the air like a ghost refusing to leave the party. Inside the mess, the stove fought a losing battle against the cold, the coffee froze in the cups before anyone could finish a sip, and the men sat shoulder to shoulder not for warmth but because there simply wasn't room to be afraid alone. Cornwell had radioed for help days earlier, voice calm the way only a man who has already said goodbye can be calm, but the replies grew fainter, swallowed by static and distance, until the only voice left was the ice itself, grinding, cracking, laughing. On the 1st of October the storm hit, a whiteout so complete the world vanished, and the Baychimo lifted on a pressure ridge with a sound like God snapping a tree in half. Plates buckled, rivets popped, and somewhere deep in the hold a seam opened just enough for the sea to taste her again. When the visibility returned, the ship sat 20 feet higher than she had any right to be, tilted 15 degrees to starboard, masts leaning like drunks after last call, and the crew looked at their captain with eyes that had already started burying him. Cornwell called them together in the saloon, the one place still warm enough to feel your fingers, and he told them the truth the way a surgeon tells you the leg has to come off. The ice was winning, the coal was down to 9 days, the nearest settlement, Barrow, was 400 miles of nothing, and the company had ordered abandonment. You could hear hearts break in that room, not with screams but with the soft, wet sound of hope sliding out through the boots. Stoker Ole Nyland, who had a wife in Tromsø heavy with their first child, pressed his forehead to the bulkhead and whispered her name over and over until the metal grew warm. Wireless operator Frank Mackey, 24 and still believing love letters could outrun blizzards, clutched the last telegram from his girl in Vancouver and cried without sound because salt water on cheeks in that cold meant scars by morning. And little Tommy Doyle, who had lied about his age to get this berth, who still slept with a photograph of his mother tucked inside his cap, looked up at Cornwell and asked in a voice so small it barely disturbed the frost, "Will the ship be lonely without us, sir?" And the captain, God help him, had no answer that wouldn't shatter the boy entirely. They packed what they could carry, tinned beef, hardtack, rifles, sleeping bags stitched from reindeer hide, and on October 15th, under a sky the color of old bruises, they stepped off the Baychimo for what every man swore would be the last time. The latter groaned as Cornwell descended last, and when his boots touched the ice he turned and saluted the ship the way you salute a fallen comrade, palm trembling against his frozen brow. Behind him the Union Jack snapped once, twice, then hung limp, as if even the flag had given up. They marched south in a ragged line, 15 men and the boy, dragging sleds loaded with 2,000 pounds of survival, and every step took them farther from the only home they had known for months. Jimmy McTavish kept glancing back, convinced he could hear the engines trying to turn over, a hopeful cough in the silence, but it was only the ice shifting, squeezing the hull the way a python measures its meal. Night fell at 3 in the afternoon, a black so complete it felt solid, and they made camp in a hollow, huddling inside a snow wall while the aurora borealis danced overhead like green fire mocking their tiny spark of life. Around the Primus stove they told stories to keep the dark from noticing them. Tales of girls in Honolulu, of pubs in Liverpool where the beer never ran out, but every story ended the same way, with eyes drifting north to where the Baychimo sat alone, and someone would whisper, "She'll break up come spring, poor old girl," and someone else would answer, "Steel, don't forget," and no one knew which was crueler, the thought of her sinking or the thought of her floating forever. Days bled into weeks. They lost 3 toes between them to frostbite, shot a polar bear that came too close and wore its skin like a penance, and still the radio at Barrow crackled with nothing but ghosts. On November 24th, a blizzard pinned them for 72 hours straight, wind screaming at 90 miles an hour, snow hissing against the tent like hot sand, and when it cleared they looked north and saw her. Impossible, unmistakable. The Baychimo, upright again, masts proud against the sky, drifting free as if the ice had opened its fist just to wave goodbye. Cornwell stood in the snow with his mouth open, beard white as a prophet's, and for the first time in his life he understood what the old sailors meant when they spoke of ships with souls. She wasn't waiting for them, she was leaving them, slipping away into the white like a woman walking out of a marriage without a backward glance. The men cheered at first, wild, ragged cheers that scared ravens from the ridges because it meant salvage, it meant bonuses, it meant going home heroes instead of corpses, but the cheers died when they realized the distance, the cold, the math of calories against miles, and Captain Cornwell felt something inside him crack wider than any ice floe. Pride, maybe, or love, or the last piece of the man who once believed he could command the sea. That night Tommy Doyle woke screaming from a dream that the ship was calling his name, and when Jimmy tried to hush him the boy sobbed, "She's angry we left her, Jimmy, she's coming back to get us," and every man in that tent felt the temperature drop another 10 degrees though the thermometer never moved. They never saw her again that winter, but they felt her every night in their dreams, heard the clang of her bell across the empty miles, and when spring finally loosened its grip and the company flew them out on a borrowed Fokker, each man carried a splinter of that abandonment in his chest like shrapnel no surgeon could remove. The SS Baychimo was gone, swallowed by the Arctic's white throat, and the crew told themselves she was at the bottom where she belonged, steel finally at rest. But deep down, in the place where sailors keep their superstitions stitched to their hearts, they knew better. She was only waiting, patient as winter, stubborn as love, and somewhere out there in the endless ice she was learning how to sail without them. Spring 1932 arrived like a thief who only steals hope, and the men who had once called the SS Baychimo home scattered across the continents with frostbite scars and stories they told only when drunk enough to forget the listener's face. But the Arctic never forgets a name, and it began whispering hers the way a jealous lover murmurs an ex's across crowded rooms. In July, a schooner full of whalers out of Herschel Island rounded a pressure ridge and there she was, bow cutting the water clean as a knife through butter, smokestack cold, decks empty, yet moving at 6 knots against a wind that should have pinned her dead. The skipper, a weathered Dane named Larson, swore on his mother's grave that he saw a figure in the wheelhouse window, tall, bearded, coat flapping though no breeze touched the glass, and when he raised his binoculars the face vanished, leaving only the reflection of his own terror staring back. Word reached the Hudson's Bay Company faster than measles through a mission school, and they sent Captain Sidney Cornwell, poor broken Cornwell, who hadn't slept without laudanum since the abandonment, north again with a skeleton crew of men desperate enough to chase ghosts for double pay, men who told themselves it was just steel and timber, nothing more, even as their hearts hammered out the old rhythm of dread. They found her on August 12th, grounded lightly on a sandbar off Wainwright, hull streaked with rust like dried blood, nameplate still proud, and when Cornwell stepped aboard the gangplank he felt the deck thrum beneath his boots the way a sleeping dog twitches when it dreams of running. Jimmy McTavish was with him, Glasgow giant now thin as a knife blade, and the moment he crossed the rail he dropped to his knees and pressed both palms to the teak as if greeting a lover he'd betrayed, whispering, "Forgive me, old girl, I never meant to leave ye," and the ship answered with a single mournful creak that traveled the length of her spine and made every man aboard feel suddenly, shamefully naked. They worked for 3 days straight, pumping water from the bilges that tasted of iron and something sweeter, like rotting flowers, patching the hull with canvas and optimism, coaxing the auxiliary engine until it coughed once, twice, then caught with a roar that sounded almost triumphant. Cornwell stood on the bridge gripping the wheel so hard his knuckles split, eyes burning with tears he refused to let fall, because for one shining moment he believed he could take her home, prove the sea wrong, prove himself still a captain and not just a man who had walked away. But the ice has a memory longer than any man's pride, and on the 4th night a fog rolled in thicker than whale blubber, swallowing the stars, the moon, the difference between living and dead, and when dawn clawed its way back the Baychimo was gone again, slipped her moorings like a woman sliding from a married man's bed, leaving only a torn hawser dangling in the water and the faint smell of coal smoke hanging in the air like perfume from a woman you'll never see again. Cornwell radioed Barrow in a voice stripped raw, begging for aircraft, for dogs, for anything, but the company men in Winnipeg just sighed and marked another line in the ledger labeled unrecoverable loss, because steel is cheap and reputation's cheaper still. The sightings kept coming, each one a needle under the skin of every sailor who heard it. September 1932, Inuit hunters near Point Barrow watched her glide past under full sail, though her sails had been furled since 29, and an old woman named Kukjuk swore she heard a child crying from the Fos Lee, the same high note Tommy Doyle used to hit when homesick. March 1933, the trading schooner Trader out of Nome spotted her locked in pack ice yet drifting against the current, and when they maneuvered closer they saw fresh footprints on the snow-covered deck, boot prints size 10, leading from the companionway to the rail and then simply stopping, as if the walker had stepped off the edge of the world. By 1934 the Baychimo had become the Arctic's favorite ghost story, told around seal oil lamps in igloos and diesel stoves in trapper cabins, and grown men who laughed at priests crossed themselves when her name was spoken because every tale ended the same way. She was waiting for her crew, waiting to finish the conversation they had started when they walked away. In August 1935 a party of company men led by a hard-eyed inspector named Gerhardt finally boarded her again, this time near Topkoke, and they found the saloon exactly as the crew had left it 4 years earlier, coffee cups frozen mid-sip, a game of cribbage laid out with the 15-2 hand still waiting to be pegged, and on the captain's bunk a single reindeer hide mitten that Tommy Doyle's mother had knitted back in Seattle, the one he'd lost the night they abandoned ship. Gerhardt was a practical man, a man who believed in ledgers and longitude, but when he picked up that mitten the wool was warm as living skin, and he dropped it with a curse that echoed down the empty corridor like a gunshot. They stripped her of anything valuable, brass fittings, the ship's bell, even the porcelain sink from the captain's washroom, and still she refused to sink, floating higher in the water without her ballast of human greed, and when they cast off the line she followed them for 3 miles, slow and stately, before turning north into a fog bank that swallowed her whole. The last official attempt came in 1939, a full 8 years after abandonment, when the company chartered a stout little icebreaker called the Northland and sent Cornwell one final time, older now, hair gone white as the world he hunted through. They found her in March, locked in the ice 30 miles off Icy Cape, and Cornwell boarded alone because none of the new crew would set foot on that cursed hulk. And he walked her decks from stem to stern calling each man's name, McTavish, Nyland, Mackie Doyle, like a roll call for the dead. In the engine room he found Jimmy's old pipe lying on the grating, tobacco still fragrant, and when he lifted it to his lips out of habit a curl of smoke rose as if someone had just tapped out the ashes, and Cornwell felt the ship shudder beneath him, not the groan of ice but something deeper, something almost like a sigh of recognition. He stayed aboard that night, alone with his ghost, wrapped in the same greatcoat he'd worn in 31, and he spoke to her the way you speak to a wife who has already left but still sleeps beside you. Apologies, promises, the small lies we tell, the ones we've failed. At dawn the ice cracked open with a sound like the sky tearing in half, and the Baychimo slid free, engines silent, sails furled, yet moving faster than any wind could push her, and Cornwell stood at the rail watching the Northland shrink to a toy boat behind him until the fog rose up and erased the world. They say he never came back, that the company listed him lost with vessel, but the Inuit along the coast tell a different story, how on certain nights when the aurora burns green as envy you can see 2 ships sailing side by side, one with lights and one without, and if you listen past the wind you can hear a boy's voice calling, "Captain," across the water, and an older voice answering, steady as a heartbeat, "I'm here, lad. I never really left." By 1939 the world had bigger ghosts to chase, war drums in Europe, empires cracking like old ice. But up north the Baychimo kept sailing, crewless, undamaged, unrepentant, a steel widow wearing her mourning proudly, and every soul who saw her felt the same cold finger trace their spine because they understood, bone deep, that some things refuse to die simply because we walk away from them. She was out there still, waiting for the rest of her family to come home, and the Arctic, vast and patient, kept her secret warm beneath its frozen skin. The war came north like a fever dream nobody invited, and suddenly the Arctic was crawling with men in uniforms who had no business being there. American sailors fresh from California sunshine, Canadian airmen with frost on their eyelashes, Soviet lookouts who spoke of the Baychimo only in whispers because ghosts were bourgeois superstition until the ice proved otherwise. In March 1942, a U.S. Navy PBY Catalina flying convoy cover out of Dutch Harbor spotted her dead ahead, cutting through loose pack at 9 knots with no wake, no smoke, no lights, just a black silhouette against the pale sky that made the pilot bank so hard he spilled coffee across the navigator's charts. When he circled back for a second pass the sea was empty except for a single raven riding the thermals where she had been, and the crew logged it as possible enemy Q-ship because the alternative was worse for morale. Down on the ice, Inuit families traveling the old caravan route between Barrow and Demarcation Point learned to step wide when the dogs refused to cross certain pressure ridges, growling at nothing, tails tucked, because the nothing had a name and it smelled of coal smoke and abandoned love. Old Kukjuk, the woman who had heard Tommy Doyle crying back in 32, told her granddaughter that the ship walked now the way a widow walks through her dead husband's clothes. Slow, deliberate, touching every memory until the cloth remembers the shape of the man. By 1944 the Baychimo had drifted east into Canadian waters, and a company trader named Mac McLeod, drunk on Hudson's Bay rum in a cabin near Cambridge Bay, swore he woke to find his door unlatched and boot prints of melted snow leading from the threshold to the stove and back again, prints that matched the one seen on her deck a decade earlier, size 10, narrow heel, the ghost of a man who had never stopped pacing his lost bridge. The war ended, empires crumbled, new flags flew, but she kept sailing, indifferent to treaties and ceasefires, a steel reminder that some losses outlast victories. In the summer of 1947 a Norwegian sealer called the Polarlice nearly rammed her in the Beaufort Sea at midnight sun. The lookout screamed so loud the captain dropped his pipe overboard, and when they turned searchlights on her the decks were swept clean, hatches battened, yet every porthole glowed faint green like foxfire, and from the open cargo hatch rose the smell of wet fur and warm bread. The smell of the mess deck on a Friday night when the cook baked cinnamon rolls for men who would never taste them again. They radioed Yellowknife, begged permission to board, but by the time the Mounties arrived she had vanished into a squall that wasn't on any chart, leaving only a child's mitten frozen to the rail of the Polarlice, the same reindeer hide pattern Tommy Doyle's mother had knitted 16 years before, and the mate who found it wept without knowing why. The 1950s brought helicopters and radar and men who believed machines could measure mystery, and still she mocked them. In 1955 the U.S. Air Force tracked an unidentified surface contact for 72 hours west of Point Lay, moving in perfect circles 8 miles across, speed steady at 4 knots, no heat signature, no echo that made sense. When AC-47 flew low enough to buzz her, the pilot reported every window lit from within yet no flicker, no bulb, just steady corpse light, and in the wheelhouse a figure in a greatcoat raised one arm in salute before the plane's shadow crossed the deck and the ship simply wasn't there anymore, contact lost, film from the gun camera fogged white as if the lens itself refused to remember. Pilots started calling her Cornwell's Revenge, and the name stuck like burrs on a parka, passed from squadron to squadron until even the brass stopped laughing. The Cold War turned the Arctic into a chessboard of submarines and listening posts, and the Baychimo became the queen nobody could capture. In 1962, during the Cuban crisis when the world held its breath, a Soviet trawler disguised as a fishing boat picked her up on sonar drifting backward through the Chukchi Sea, propellers silent, yet making 12 knots against a 30-knot wind. The political officer ordered depth charges just in case, but when the water settled she surfaced again, closer, bow pointed straight at them like an accusation, and the captain, a man who had survived Stalingrad, ordered full astern so fast the engine screamed because some enemies you do not engage. The crew locked themselves below decks and prayed to gods they had been taught were dead, and when dawn came the sea was empty except for a single playing card floating face up, an ace of spades from the cribbage game left unfinished in 1931. By the late 60s she had become folklore stitched into survival suits, a story elders told wide-eyed teenagers before their first strapline. Respect the ice, respect the ship, because she is still looking for her boys and she does not know they grew old and died in warm beds far south. Yet every year someone saw her. A Bush pilot in 1964 landed on a floe to repair a ski and found fresh coffee grounds scattered across the snow, still steaming. Oil rig workers at Prudhoe Bay in 1967 watched her pass so close they could read the rust-flaked letters of her name, and every man aboard that rig quit the same week, cashing checks they never spent because money felt suddenly childish. The last photograph ever taken, grainy, overexposed, taken by a geologist named Sarah Putnick in the winter of 1968, shows the Baychimo framed against the aurora, sails set though no canvas had flown for 40 years, and if you enlarge the image until the pixels bleed you can see 2 figures on the poop deck. One tall, bearded, coat flapping in a wind that touched nothing else, and beside him a smaller shadow, hand raised as if waving across half a century of frozen longing. Sarah mailed the photo to her sister in Montreal with a note that read, "I think they just wanted someone to see them together again," and 3 weeks later the envelope came back unopened, marked addressee unknown, though her sister had lived at that address for 15 years. By then the world had walked on the moon and forgotten how to be afraid of its own shadows, but up north the Baychimo kept her lonely vigil, slipping between icebergs like a memory that refuses to fade, and children born in igloos along the coast grew up learning that some doors, once closed, open again from the other side. The whispers grew softer, farther apart, but never stopped. They became the wind's favorite lullaby, carrying the names of 23 men and one boy across a sea that no longer needed ships to be haunted. She was out there still, patient as permafrost, proud as first love, waiting for the ice to give back what it had taken, or for the last living soul who remembered her crew to breathe his final breath so she could finally rest. But memory is stubborn stuff, and as long as a single tongue could shape the syllables Baychimo, she sailed on, crewless, undamaged, unrepentant, through the long Arctic night that has no sunrise and no forgiveness, only the slow, relentless promise that some ghosts do not fade. They simply learn to live without us. November 1969, and the Arctic had grown tired of pretending to be tame. The sun had abandoned the sky for good, leaving only a bruised purple glow that never quite became day, and every breath tasted of diesel and endings. A party of Inuit hunters, 3 brothers and their uncle, old enough to remember stories told by grandfathers who had seen the Baychimo with their own eyes, were running a trapline along the sea ice west of Point Barrow when the lead dog, Nanook, suddenly sat down and refused to move, ears flat, whining in a key that made the hair rise on every man's neck. The youngest brother, Jimmy Ockpick, 19 and still believing bullets could solve anything, laughed and prodded the dog with his boot, but when he looked up the laughter froze in his throat because there she was, no more than 200 yards off, sliding through a lead of black water that shouldn't have been open this late in the year. The SS Baychimo, taller than memory, rust the color of dried blood, riding high and proud as the day she first left Glasgow in 1921, and every porthole blazing with that same cold green light that had made grown men weep 30 years before. Uncle Isaac dropped his rifle. The clang of metal on ice sounded like a church bell in the stillness, and the ship answered with a single deliberate groan that rolled across the frozen sea and settled inside their chests like a second heartbeat. They stood frozen, 4 men and 7 dogs, while the Baychimo drifted closer, slow as regret, until they could read the name on her bow in letters flaked but unbroken, until they could see the frost feathers on her rigging spelling words no human hand had written. Jimmy raised his father's old Leica camera with fingers that trembled so badly the first 2 shots blurred into green streaks, but the third, God help him, caught her perfectly, masts stark against the aurora, wheelhouse windows glowing, and on the bridge wing 2 figures clear as frostbite scars. One tall, coat whipping in a wind that touched nothing else, beard white as the snow under their boots. Beside him a smaller shadow, cap askew, one mitten raised in a wave that had waited 38 years to be returned. Isaac whispered a single word in Inupiaq that meant both forgive and remember, and the ship seemed to hear because she slowed, almost stopped, the bow swinging toward them as if turning into a dock she had never forgotten. For one impossible moment the hunters felt the ice beneath their mukluk soften, felt the presence of every man who had ever sailed on her, Cornwell's steady gaze, Jimmy McTavish's booming laugh, Tommy Doyle's homesick sniffle, all crowded onto that deck watching them with eyes that held no blame, only the terrible patience of the dead who have learned that time is just another ocean to cross. Then Jimmy Ockpick, 19 and stupid with courage, took one step forward, boot crunching through the snow crust, and called out across the water the only English he trusted in that moment, "Captain, we see you." The words left his mouth as white smoke and hung in the air like a prayer, and the Baychimo answered. Not with sound, though every dog howled at once, but with light. Every porthole flared brighter, the green turning gold, and from the cargo hatch rose a cloud of snow that swirled upward into the shape of a boy running, arms outstretched, before dissolving into the aurora like sugar in hot tea. The tall figure on the bridge raised one hand, slow, deliberate, palm forward in salute or blessing or farewell, and the smaller shadow copied the gesture exactly, mitten and bare hands side by side the way they must have stood 1,000 times on warmer decks. Isaac fell to his knees then, not from cold but from the weight of being seen by something that had been looking for witnesses since 1931, and when he looked up again the ship was moving, sliding past them faster now, bow pointed north toward the pole where no compass agrees and no map dares go. Jimmy fired off 3 more shots, film advancing with frantic clicks, but when the roll was developed weeks later in a darkroom in Anchorage only the last frame held anything at all. The Baychimo framed against the northern lights, deck empty, wheelhouse dark, yet across the negative someone had scratched with a needle the words, "Thank you, we are home," in handwriting every schoolchild in Barrow recognized from Captain Cornwell's old logbooks preserved in the museum. The hunters never spoke of it publicly, who would believe 4 Inuit against 40 years of silence. But they left a tin of pilot bread and a bottle of Hudson's Bay rum on the ice where she had passed, and every spring after that the offering vanished, tin dented as if crushed by loving hands, bottle empty and recorked with a cork carved into the shape of a small boy's face smiling. The photographs, those that survived, made their way into locked drawers and family Bibles, shown only to grandchildren on nights when the aurora burned especially bright, and always with the same warning whispered in the dark. She only shows herself when someone still remembers the names. After 1969, the sighting stopped the way a heartbeat stops, not gradually but all at once, and the Arctic settled into a silence so complete men claimed they could hear their own blood freeze. Bush pilots flew the same routes for decades and saw nothing but white on white. Satellites stared down with cold electronic eyes and found only ice. The company closed the file for good in 1978, stamped presumed lost across Cornwell's last report, and the world moved on to oil spills and moon landings and wars that had nothing to do with ghosts. Yet sometimes, on nights when the temperature drops so fast thermometers crack, the old-timers in Barrow swear they hear it, the slow clang of a ship's bell far out on the pack, ringing 8 bells for the end of a watch that never ended, followed by a boy's voice calling, "All's well," across water that has forgotten how to be water. And if you stand very still, if you let the cold crawl inside your bones until you forget your own name, you can feel her pass, not as steel and rust but as memory made solid, gliding beneath the ice like a promise kept too late. The SS Baychimo never sank because some things are stronger than gravity. Love that refuses to loosen its grip, duty that outlives the body, the stubborn refusal of 23 men and one boy to let their story end with abandonment. She is up there still, locked in the Arctic's white throat, sailing waters no chart has ever named, waiting for the last living soul who carries even a fragment of their names to breathe out that final breath so she can turn south at last, home to Seattle or Glasgow or wherever lost ships go when the crew is finally, completely together again. Until then, the ice keeps her secret, the aurora keeps her lights, and every November, when the sun gives up and the darkness remembers how to be absolute, you can stand on the shore at Point Barrow and watch for a green glow on the horizon that moves against the wind. If you see it, don't call out. Just raise your hand, palm forward, the way a captain salutes the sea he can never quite leave, because she isn't looking for rescue anymore. She's looking for permission to come home, and some doors, once closed by cowardice and cold, can only be opened from the inside. The Baychimo sails on, crew complete at last, through an ocean of ice and time that parts for her the way it never did for the living, and somewhere in that endless white night Tommy Doyle stands beside his captain, mitten finally matched, both of them smiling at a horizon that never quite arrives. The final glimpse was never hers, it was ours, a gift from the dead to the living, proof that some ghosts don't haunt us. We haunt them by forgetting. And as long as a single voice, yours, mine, a child not yet born, can still speak the name Baychimo without shivering, she will keep sailing, keep searching, keep the bell ringing 8 times across the frozen dark, because the Arctic is vast but memory is vaster, and love, God help us all, is the one thing cold cannot kill. And there she sails, still, somewhere beyond the edge of every map, cutting through the black water under a sky that never quite lets the sun return. The SS Baychimo, her bell silent now, her green lights dim to embers only the dead can see, carrying 23 men and one eternal boy toward a horizon that keeps its promises. If you felt that chill crawl up your spine, if your breath fogged the screen while you listened, if you just looked over your shoulder to check the dark behind you, then you already know. Some stories don't end when the last word is spoken. They wait. They watch. And sometimes, on the coldest nights, they whisper your name across the ice. So here's what I need you to do right now before the feeling fades. Hit that subscribe button like you're slamming a hatch against the Arctic wind. Turn on the bell so YouTube drags you back here the second I drop the next nightmare. Speech balloon comment, I saw her. If the Baychimo just sailed through your dreams tonight. Mobile phone with arrow, share this with the one friend who still checks under the bed, because ghosts travel faster when someone believes.